If you're into cool tunes, some easy to listen to jam session music, check out Alan Chapell, also formerly known as Chapell Roan. That's fine. But in all seriousness, we are super excited to welcome Alan as today's expert for the Privacy Exchange Community Show and Tell series. Alan Chapell is a leading expert in digital media and privacy. His career has spanned over 15 years, and he's worked in roles such as outside counsel and chief privacy officer roles for over 100 technology companies, which seems unbelievable to me. But 12 of those companies, Alan has helped take public, which is also a huge feat. So congratulations to you, Alan. So today, Alan's law firm, Chapell and Associates, serves interactive technology, media, and advertising companies. So today, that's what we'll be talking about, interactive marketing. And he will be drawing from experience working with those advertising firms, navigating privacy issues from like the beginning of this era to what we're seeing now and in the future and beyond. So as usual, we'll spend the next 25 minutes together, folks. We'll do 10 to 15 minutes with an interview with me and Alan, and then we will open it up to audience Q&A, at which point we will stop our recording. And as a reminder, this information shared today is for general information purposes only and is not considered legal advice. So if you need legal advice, please contact your own attorney. This is just information today. All right, with all of the necessities out of the way, let's get started. Alan, first question to you. Can you share a little bit about your current role with your law firm, what you do, who you serve, and the types of work that come up the most?
Sure. So my bread and butter over the last 20 years has been outside counsel and privacy advisor, mostly to the adtech and martech community, mostly VC funded, often really small companies. Typically, I'm the first privacy, if you want to call it, hire, where I'm the sort of the fractional chief privacy officer. And then as the company hopefully grows, I might slide over into an advisory capacity because they've got like a team of privacy people by then. But there's another component to my business, which is sort of an output of all that stuff. And it's called the Chapell Report. It's a think, Forrester or Gartner. It's sort of a continuous information resource that comes at you at a monthly report focusing on privacy, addressability, AI, competition, public policy in the digital media space worldwide. And my premise is that there is so much going on for the busy privacy or public policy pro. And if you're not, Amazon or Oracle and have a whole team of people to cover that stuff for you, that it's just really hard to both keep up with everything and then to connect the dots of what's going on in Europe and how that impacts what's going on in the US and vice versa. And so the Chapell Report is becoming more and more of a resource for not just the startup folks, but the investment community. And there's some pretty large legal teams that, just sort of like the additional POV. And so that's been my business for the last, 20 years or so.
Okay, that is so fascinating. I did not know that. I'm glad you told us about that. Now it's starting to make sense with how you've had 100 companies under your leadership. So it's the fractional expertise, and then you move into an advisory role. But then I'm assuming you take all of that experience and then have packaged it into this knowledge product called, what is it called again? The Chapell Report?
The Chapell Report.
Oh, fascinating. So is that like a monthly subscription or how do you get access?
Yeah, it's a monthly subscription. I've toyed with doing kind of a free version, and I've had a little trouble with, if somebody's paying you like a Forrester Gartner type of a rate, you're always worried about cannibalizing that with something free. And I'm still experimenting with how to give away the free stuff so as to drive the subscriptions. One of the things that I'm thinking about and talking to some people about is actually doing my own podcast, because I think that there's room for multiple different discussions taking place in the digital media space.
Oh, fascinating. All right. Well, so I'm just going to ask you for like a taste of what's in there. So my next question is really about what do you find most interesting? And I'm assuming you've written about that in this report. So give us an idea of what your attention is focused on at the moment, topic wise.
Well, there's a whole bunch of things. So one is, the use of AI and Europe has I think taken the lead in many respects in trying to regulate AI. But the positions that they're taking, I like pointing out seams and things. I'm not judging, but the current thinking seems to be that you can screen scrape the entirety of the internet under a legitimate interest standard with some opt-outs and some additional transparency and maybe some DSAR rights. But the use of a single IP address requires a consent in another context. That's sort of weird for me. And I'm trying to figure out, how do we as a community reconcile those two concepts? I'm not saying either is right or wrong. I am saying that there is an inconsistency in how those folks are viewing things. And not to hate on the Europeans, we've got all kinds of seams and inconsistencies in the good old US of A as well.
Oh, that is fascinating. Wow, I don't even know how to start thinking about that. Even like the FTC came out today saying, again, like browser data is sensitive personal data and IP addresses, of course. So like, how do you, what is that, round the square or square the round? I don't know. Interesting.
Well, and the FTC has done a wonderful job, I think, pushing the envelope, particularly in the digital media world where I tend to inhabit. They were the ones, at least maybe the second org, to really push the concept that an IP address was personal data. I think the first was Canada, but the FTC was not far behind there, and they're able to push the envelope despite the fact that they don't have a ton of actual power. They're able to come after you for making deceptive claims, and they're able to come after you for unfair actions, but that's a difficult thing to prove often. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but the current thinking, at least at the Supreme Court level in the US, is that administrative agencies need to be reined in, or at least don't have a ton of autonomy to, we'll say, create new law. And so the FTC is operating in an environment there they don't have a ton of power, and nonetheless have been able to have a fair amount of influence. And so kudos.
Oh, yeah. Well, so this is super interesting, and we came to talk about a post-Chevron world. So give us the lay of the land, like read us up from like what is the implication of the Chevron decision or overturning Chevron, and then how are you starting to see that play out with like an agency like the FTC when it comes to privacy enforcement?
It's a great question. And so I'm going to start with two things that I love to say. Number one, and the Chapell Report is based on this, there is always a backstory. And if you help people understand what the backstory is, then they can understand how to implement the current rule set. Even if they agree or disagree with it philosophically, with the backstory, I think you can get a better sense. And then the second thing I like to say is, it all comes down to the Reagan years. And so much of what we're doing right now is been influenced by, the 1980s and how there was sort of this political movement to get the government off of our backs. And that's manifesting itself in many of the competition trials taking place right now, because it's really hard for the government to make a case. But anyway, back to Chevron. I think we talked about going into rabbit holes. I'm going to try not to. And we'll get back to Chevron. Chevron is a legal concept that came about in 1984, where the Supreme Court ruled that administrative agencies should be given the benefit of the doubt when interpreting laws or creating their own regulations based on those laws. And there's a backstory there I don't know if we'll have time for, but the premise behind it was, in 1984, the Supreme Court said, yeah, we shouldn't have judges making law. We should have administrative agencies. Those are the experts. That makes sense to have them making laws. And philosophically, a lot of us, I think, would agree with that. What the Supreme Court is saying now in the Loper case, but really over the last several years, this current Supreme Court has been suspicious, if not overtly hostile, towards administrative agencies and their ability to regulate. And what the Supreme Court is now is sort of reverting back to a original intent of the founders, strict constructionist type of a view, where they're saying, like, no, an administrative agency has less power. They can't go an inch over what the words in the law told them that they could do. And that's having a pretty significant impact in our little part of the world, because it clearly shows, what the FTC can do, what the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau can do, what the HHS can do in the context of HIPAA. Those agencies are basically being told that they can't go an inch over what the powers that the law gives you. So bringing it back to the FTC, which I've said doesn't have a ton of power outside the specific powers given to it by Congress, this is going to make the whole MAG-MOS process that they're trying to go after commercial surveillance is going to make that whole process much, much more difficult.
If you had to be a betting man, like, what do you think the outcome is? So like the commercial surveillance stuff, there's a new report that came out, I think yesterday, the FTC came out with this report saying that there's a lot of commercial surveillance going out there. And so it seems like this is an area they're going to go after. How does this end?
Well, so the first thing I would say, if it's the report I'm thinking of, that's a staff report. So that doesn't really have the force of law. That's really the way that should be viewed, is that's a postcard from the FTC saying how the staff at the FTC thinks the market should move. Now, sometimes they write those reports to help urge Congress to do something, but that seems to be a rather bit of an uphill battle, particularly over the last few years when it comes to privacy. Sometimes they'll do that as a precursor to an announcement of enforcement actions. But again, that gets me back to this Chevron deference, because the Supreme Court recently kind of overruled that deference. And that's really, and I don't want to talk about Chevron as much as just the overriding hostility towards the powers of regulatory agencies. And the challenge with that, from a perspective of the FTC, is you're emboldening businesses to challenge your authority if the businesses think that the courts are going to support that challenge. And so that's sort of where we are with that report. Interesting findings. I've only taken a quick scan through it. Certainly, if you're running a privacy program, certainly things to look at, but it doesn't have the force of law or really anything close to that.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess my takeaway from that is it's an urge to get Congress to pass a federal privacy law, but I'm not holding my breath on that at all. Okay, we're getting close to my 15 minutes being up here. Let me just ask you one more question, then we'll open up to audience questions. We spoke a little bit about the expanding definition of personal data, especially what's known as de-identified data. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in your role and like how that's coming up in practice in this work? Sure.
So in the ad tech world, we've sort of transitioned from a very unregulated environment to one that's increasingly more so. And when I first started in this area, even in Europe, you could plausibly make the argument that we aren't touching personal data. It's all pseudonymous. Therefore, your laws do not apply to me. That's probably an overstatement, but not by much. And so what happened about 12 years ago is the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, in coming up with guidance around behavioral advertising, said, hey, you know what? An IP address and pseudonymous data is personal data. Now, they did that so as to make sure that people recognize that pseudonymous data was covered under Canada's privacy law. And then a couple of years later, the FTC, both via COPPA and then separately from that, said, yeah, an IP address and pseudonymous data is personal data. And then came GDPR, which I think made really clear that that pseudonymous identifiers, a mobile ad ID, et cetera, is personal data. And then you've got the CCPA and U.S. state privacy laws, which really bend over backwards. I mean, I don't think it's possible to have a data set that really isn't covered under that rule set, and that creates its own set of challenges, because California has a concept of personal data and they have a concept of de-identified data, but right now it's not entirely clear where one leaves off and the other takes over. So you have this Schrodinger's cat issue where a data set can be both de-identified and personal data. And that's a little bit of a challenge, because what you want to do is incent the marketplace to adopt things like data minimization and to reduce the data that they're collecting and to reduce the likelihood of re-identification using the data set. But if everything is personal data and you got to treat it the same anyway, you really you are really not incentivizing the marketplace in a way that is privacy protective, in my view.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that Schrodinger's cat example. Like, it's not identifiable data until you look at it, or is it just always identifiable data? I don't know. Thank you for that. So let's open it up to audience questions.